there is belief, and then there is skepticism. And between those two lies a vast territory of questions and the unknown. But what if reality is far more complex than we've been willing to perceive? And what if the stories that we dismiss as myth and legend hold the keys to understanding consciousness? From ghostly encounters to mysterious lights in the sky, humanity has always sensed there was something more out there. Some call it the paranormal, and others call it the divine. Some search the stars for answers, while others look within. They are all connected, threads in the grand tapestry of life. But we stand at a place where the fabric between realities is much thinner than you might think, because this is Crossroads of the Veil.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
We often tell ourselves that secrets are just pieces of information. We think of them as lines of text on a page, files buried on a hard drive, or whispers in a hallway. We imagine that if we just found the right key or hacked the right server, the truth would spill out like coins from a slot machine. But that is a fantasy. In the deep world, the world of the career intelligence officer, a secret is not just data. It is a physical weight. It is a wall. It is a distinct state of reality that changes the person holding it. Tonight, we are walking into the most heavily guarded room in the history of the United States government. We are going to talk about a specific type of lock that was forged in the fires of the Manhattan Project. It has kept the world's most dangerous truths safe for nearly 80 years. You have likely heard of top secret. You may have even heard of special access programs. But there is a level of clearance that sits a world apart. It is the clearance that guards the sun-hot fires of nuclear weapons. It is called the Q clearance. To understand the story we are about to tell, the story of how the United States government finally, officially, and secretly went hunting for UFOs, you have to understand why the man who ran the program and held one of these clearances. This isn't just government red tape. This is the key to understanding why the truth feels like it has been trapped behind a wall. Our story centers on a man standing at the exact center of a reality shift. He is not a fringe conspiracy theorist. He is not an outsider shouting at the gates. He is the ultimate insider. His name is Dr. James T. Lacatski. He is a ballistic missile physicist, a rocket scientist, and an intelligence analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency. He is a quiet man who spent his days calculating the trajectories of intercontinental death. But one day he decided to use his clearance to look for something else, something that wasn't supposed to exist. To really understand Dr. Lacatski, you have to understand the world he lived in. In 2007, his office was in the warning center of the Defense Intelligence Agency. If you want to visualize his life, imagine a windowless room filled with the hum of computer servers and the pale blue glow of monitors. His job was not to worry about today or even next week. His job was to worry about 20 years from now. This was the place where worst-case scenarios were daily business. He was paid to be paranoid. He had to imagine the most terrifying threats possible so that the rest of us could sleep at night. Lacatski was a specialist in missiles and directed energy weapons. He spent his days staring at satellite photos of launch pads in Russia, China, or Iran. He would calculate the thrust of the engines and estimate the fuel capacity. He ran the math to see if a missile launched from the frozen plains of Siberia could hit a specific window on the Pentagon. His mind was a high-speed calculator, grounded in the absolute certainty of physics. He was a threat analyst, and in his world, everything had to make sense. If a radar blip moved at Mach 5 times the speed of sound, it had to have an engine. It had to have fuel tanks. It had to push air out of the way. That is the law of physics. Sir Isaac Newton wrote the rules hundreds of years ago, and rockets had to follow them. Anything that didn't follow the rules was either a mistake in the data or it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. But there was another layer to Lacatski's life, a layer that defined him even more than his PhD in engineering. Lacatski was a member of the Q clearance tribe. We need to stop here and really look at what that means. This wasn't just a background check where they look at your credit score. It was a character assessment designed to test if a person could live a lifetime of absolute silence. To get this clearance, he had walked through background checks that peel your life apart. The FBI interviewed his neighbors, sometimes 3 times over 3 years. They checked his bank accounts and the accounts of his in-laws. They asked his old teachers if he drank too much. They asked if he had a gambling problem. Worst of all, they asked if he had any secret political leanings that might make him susceptible to blackmail. They needed to know that he was a human vault. His entire professional identity was based on stability and discretion. The Q clearance instilled a paralyzing professional fear in everyone who held it. The fear was not of the enemy. The fear was of losing the clearance. Losing it meant losing his access to the nation's most critical work. It meant losing his professional identity. It meant being instantly marked as untrustworthy by everyone he knew. The people who hold this clearance become the secret they keep. They don't gossip at the water cooler. They don't speculate about things they haven't seen. And they don't deviate from the established reality. This is the man we are dealing with, a man of numbers and silence, a man who viewed the paranormal not as a curiosity, but as a statistical error. The thought of believing in UFOs was a joke to him. It was a weakness. It was something that would disqualify him from ever holding the Q clearance again. He had spent his career dismissing the bizarre as noise, but in the spring of 2007, that world cracked. It started with a book. It seems ridiculous. A high-level intelligence officer with access to the world's most sensitive databases found a clue in a paperback he bought at a bookstore. The book was titled Hunt for the Skinwalker. Lacatski picked it up in March of 2007. He didn't read it for the ghost stories. He read it like an engineer. He read it as a threat assessment. The book told the story of a ranch in northeastern Utah. A billionaire named Robert Bigelow had bought the property because the family living there was being terrorized. They reported seeing bulletproof wolves. They saw lights that turned night into day. They saw holes open in the sky. It was a bizarre mashup of folklore and terrifying events. Most people read that book as a scary story. They read it for the thrill, like a horror movie. But Lacatski read it and saw data points. He sat in his secure, windowless office reading about an object that flew silently over cattle. The witnesses said it moved instantly from one spot to another. They described vehicles that moved without apparent inertia. They stopped instantly. They accelerated without appearing to generate G-forces. Lacatski knew about G-forces. He knew that extreme G-forces would turn a biological occupant, like a human pilot, into paste. He knew that to move an object instantly, you needed energy that didn't exist in our textbooks. You needed a command of gravity that only existed in theory. He put the book down and looked at his whiteboard. In his day job, he studied the most advanced weapons on Earth. He knew what the Russians had. He knew what the Chinese were building. He knew that to move an object instantly, you needed energy that didn't exist in our inventory. He asked himself a question that most scientists in his position are too afraid to ask. What if the witnesses aren't crazy? If the story was true, even just 10%, it meant something huge. It meant there was a technology flying around Utah that made the U.S. look like they were flying paper airplanes. If this technology could manipulate gravity, it could easily render all U.S. defense systems obsolete. This wasn't a ghost story anymore. It was a threat assessment of the highest order. If there was a drone that could fly without making a sound, he needed to know who built it. If there was a weapon that could manipulate human minds, he needed to know how it worked. He viewed the paranormal activity not as supernatural. He viewed it as evidence of physics so far beyond human comprehension that it simply appeared magical. This is where the architect of disclosure began his work, not with a leak, but with a letter. In April of 2007, Lacatski sat down with his friend and colleague, Jonathan Axelrod, in the Defense Warning Office. Axelrod was another serious man, a naval intelligence officer who was about to ship out for a covert assignment in Iraq. Lacatski pushed the book across the desk. He told Axelrod about the cattle mutilations, the intelligently controlled orbs, and the weird flying machines. Axelrod, an open-minded thinker, listened politely. He was skeptical, but he took the book. Later, Axelrod would tell stories of sitting around the pool in the Green Zone in Baghdad, with bombs going off in the distance, reading about bulletproof wolves in Utah. The book passed from hand to hand among the intelligence officers in the war zone. It became a strange favorite among men who dealt with real bloody reality every day. It spoke to something in them, the idea that the world was stranger than the war they were fighting. Back in Washington, Lacatski made his move. He didn't go to the tabloids. He went to his computer and drafted a letter. He put it on an official Defense Intelligence Agency letterhead, which made it a federal document. He wrote to Robert Bigelow, the aerospace mogul who owned the ranch. The letter, dated June 19, 2007, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic bravery. He wrote, "I presently work in the Defense Warning Office of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The purpose of my visit would be to assist me in developing a strategy on how my office can characterize the potential threat aspects of the phenomena encountered in your research efforts." Look at the language. He didn't ask to see the ghosts. He asked to characterize the threat aspects. He used the language of the Pentagon. He talked about novel aerospace signatures and energy manipulation. He was using the correct military language to investigate a phenomenon that was completely outside the military scope. He went further. He wrote, "In my division's threat publications, it is not necessary for the reader to understand the complete nature and motivation of the threat sources, only the specifics of the threat itself. In the case of your ranch, potential threat characteristics should be able to eventually be described, though the source of those potential threats remains unknown." He was telling Bigelow, "I don't care if it's aliens, ghosts, or Russians. I care about what it does. I care about the physics." He was taking a massive risk. In the Pentagon, talking about UFOs is usually career suicide. It is how you get sent to a desk in the basement, and it is how you lose your clearance. People think you're unstable. But Lacatski had the shield of his Q clearance background. He was known as a serious man, and he framed the investigation as a matter of preemptive strategic defense. He didn't care about the stigma. He was looking at the math, and the math said we were missing something. He mailed the letter. A few weeks later, he was on a plane to Las Vegas to meet Robert Bigelow. The two men were opposites. Bigelow was the charismatic billionaire who made a fortune in real estate and was now spending it to build space habitats and hunt for the afterlife. Lacatski was the quiet analyst, the man in the suit who measured missile fuel. But they bonded over the idea that there were things in the sky that defied explanation. On July 26, 2007, they boarded Bigelow's private jet and flew to Vernal, Utah, a small town on the edge of the high desert bowl known as the Uinta Basin. The Uinta Basin is a strange, quiet place. It is surrounded by mountains that look like the jagged teeth of a sleeping giant. The ground is hard, packed dirt and sagebrush that stretches out for miles. The silence there is heavy. It feels like the land is holding its breath. The air is dry, carrying the faint metallic scent of ozone, which the locals sometimes associate with high strangeness events. It's 8. Within an hour of landing, Bigelow and Lacatski were in a white SUV driving down the dirt road into Skinwalker Ranch. Lacatski was wearing his street clothes. He carried the skeptical, analytical mind of a government scientist. He was there to observe, measure, and debunk. As they drove, they stopped to visit a neighbor, a rancher named Gonzalez. Bigelow asked if anything had happened recently. He told them a story that would have sounded insane anywhere else. He said that just a few weeks ago he had seen two orange spheres flying together next to the mesa wall. Suddenly both objects turned and flew directly into the rock. They didn't crash. They just vanished into the solid stone. Gonzalez then told them about a morning when he saw one of his cows frozen in the front yard, staring at the side of the house. He stepped out and saw a large orange sphere resting on the grass. He did what any sane person would do. He backed up, went inside, and closed the door. When he looked out later, it was gone. Lacatski listened. He didn't laugh. He filed the data. This was the environment he was entering, a place where physics seemed to be optional. They drove onto the ranch property. It looked deceptive. The Russian olive trees and cedars were in full bloom. The pastures were green. It looked like a paradise, but the locals called it the Path of the Skinwalker. They headed for the small manager's dwelling known as Homestead 1. It was a modest, rectangular building with cheap paneling on the walls and linoleum floors that had seen better days. Inside, they met Jean and Richard Dietz, the husband and wife team who managed the property for Bigelow. They sat in the dining room. It was a mundane setting, a simple kitchen table with sunlight streaming through the window. Lacatski sat with his back to the front door, facing toward the kitchen area. Bigelow and the couple were chatting about ranch operations, irrigation, cattle, the usual. Lacatski was focused. His eyes darted to any security camera feed or measuring instrument in the room. He was likely asking himself about radiation levels or magnetic anomalies in the soil. He was looking for the trick. He was waiting to find the hidden wires or the misidentified military flares that explained the stories. He expected disappointment, or at best he expected a vague anomaly that could be easily explained away. Then the air in the room changed. It became heavy. It felt thick, like standing at the bottom of a deep swimming pool. A slight pressure built behind his eyes. It was a subtle change in the air quality that felt unnervingly biological. It didn't happen with a loud bang. There was no lightning strike outside. Dr. James Lacatski looked up from the table. He looked past Bigelow. He looked into the adjacent kitchen. There, floating in the middle of the room, was an object. It wasn't a ghost. It was a structure, and it looked manufactured. It looked deliberate. It was entirely out of place against the backdrop of the dusty kitchen and the cheap paneling. Lacatski later described it with the cold precision of an engineer. He called it a complex, semi-opaque, yellowish, tubular structure. Let's break that description down so we can really see what he saw. Tubular. It had a defined shape. It was a cylinder. It looked manufactured. It had subtle, unidentifiable etchings or seams along its surface that defied human machining techniques. It appeared to have a rotational symmetry, suggesting a deep alien logic to its design. It wasn't a natural formation, it was a machine. Yellowish. It had color. The hue was not painted on like a car. It seemed to be a result of the light interacting with the material itself. It was perhaps a function of its energy state, the subtle ionization of air around its powerful contained field. It glowed with a sickly industrial light. Semi-opaque. This is the detail that matters most. It wasn't solid metal like steel, and it wasn't clear glass. It was like a dense fog, or a strange high-tech plastic. Light could pass through it, but it blocked his view of the wall behind it. This suggested it was interacting with photons in a way that bent or diffused light. It was an intentional cloaking mechanism. The material defied classification. It was solid but permeable. It was present yet indistinct. It was hovering in midair. It was perfectly still. It violated every rule of aeronautics and mechanics Lacatski had ever memorized. Now, apply the physics he knew so well. To hover, you need lift. A helicopter uses rotors to push air down. That creates noise, a lot of it. It creates wind. Papers on the table would be flying everywhere. This object was silent. It was creating zero wind. It was defying gravity without any visible engine. It was making a mockery of the rocket science Lacatski had built his life around. His professional instinct screamed impossible, but his eyes reported fact. Lacatski stared at it. He didn't scream or run away. He analyzed. His brain was trained by the protocols to record data without emotional input. He cataloged every detail. He looked at the way the light hit it. He looked at the edges to see if they were sharp or fuzzy. Was it a hologram? No, it had depth and shadow. Was it a hallucination? He looked away, rubbed his eyes, and looked back, performing a quick self-assessment to check his own mental stability. It was still there. It had hung there for nearly 30 seconds. Count to 30 slowly. That is a long time. It is enough time to catch your breath. It is enough time to question your entire life's work and to realize that every textbook you studied in college was incomplete. Reality itself was more flexible than you thought. For a man who dealt only in calculated reality, this was a philosophical earthquake. He realized that the foundation of his restricted world, the ultimate secret of the atom, was insignificant compared to this. The fact that he, and apparently he alone of the 4 people in the room, saw it was not lost on him. Bigelow didn't react. The ranch managers didn't react. The object had selected an audience of 1. It was a private demonstration for the man from the Pentagon. Then it vanished. It didn't fly away. It didn't shoot up through the roof. It just ceased to exist. It was as if someone had flicked a switch on its reality. It left behind a subtle, lingering scent of ozone and dust. The room was empty again. Just the hum of the refrigerator remained, and the dust dancing in the sunlight coming through the window. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. It was weighted by the sudden, irreversible knowledge that he was no longer the ultimate authority on threats. In that moment, James Lacatski changed. The theoretical threat became a tangible reality. He was no longer just an analyst looking at photos of Russian missiles. He was a man holding evidence that the entire global defense structure was built on a flawed understanding of physics. He realized that the threat was real, the technology was real, and it was right here, inside the United States borders. This proved that the phenomenon was not limited to the sky. It proved that it could enter a home. It proved that it could cloak itself from some observers while revealing itself to others. It was a technology of selective interaction. He knew he couldn't just write a report and file it away in a drawer. He needed to mobilize the government. His oath to protect the nation required him to pursue this truth. It didn't matter how professionally dangerous it was. He walked out of that trailer with a new mission. He was going to find the money, the scientists, and he was going to figure out how to build that yellow tube. Or more importantly, he was going to figure out how to defend against it. But he had no idea that the yellow tube was just the greeting card. The real message and the real danger was waiting for him back in Washington. By opening this door, he was about to invite something much darker than a machine into the halls of the Pentagon. The architect had his blueprint. Now he needed to build the structure. To do that, he would need money and the help of the most powerful men in the United States Senate. He walked out of that house and got back into the SUV with Robert Bigelow. They drove away from the ranch, past the mesa, and past the guard shack with the ominous keep out signs. The landscape rolled by, the red rock, the sagebrush, the endless empty sky. But Lacatski wasn't looking at the scenery anymore. He was looking at a new world. Most men in his position would have buried this. They would have filed it away in the deepest, darkest corner of their mind labeled "Do Not Touch." They would have gone back to the Defense Intelligence Agency, sat down at their secure terminals, and returned to calculating the fuel load of Iranian rockets. That is the safe play. That is how you keep your pension. You deny the impossible because the impossible is messy. But Lacatski didn't bury it. He operationalized it. On that flight back, a realization crystallized in his mind. It was a cold, hard, analytical conclusion. He realized that the current approach to the UFO problem, the approach the government had publicly denied, but privately flirted with for decades, was fundamentally broken. For 60 years, the military had been looking for nuts and bolts. They were looking for Soviet aircraft. They were looking for secret prototypes. The object in the kitchen wasn't just a machine, it was a phantom. It appeared without sound. It had vanished without a trace. It was semi-opaque, meaning light interacted with it in ways that shouldn't be possible for solid matter. And crucially, it had selected its audience. It had shown itself to him while hiding from the others in the room. This meant the phenomenon wasn't just aerodynamic, it was psychological. It was cognitive. It operated on the level of consciousness as much as it operated on the level of physics. Lacatski realized that if the United States government was going to figure this out, they needed a new kind of net. They couldn't just build better radar. They needed a program that was willing to look at the weird, the ghostly, and the impossible and treat it as hard data. He returned to Washington, D.C., not as a man who had seen a ghost, but as a man who had discovered a gap in national security. A gap so wide you could fly a starship through it. He needed money, and in Washington that requires power. Lacatski went to the one man who had the clearance, the curiosity, and the sheer political horsepower to make the impossible happen, Senator Harry Reid. At the time, Harry Reid was the Senate Majority Leader. He was one of the most powerful men on the planet. He controlled the flow of legislation, he controlled the budget, and unbeknownst to the public, he had a deep, abiding fascination with the unknown. Lacatski didn't just walk into Reid's office and say, "I saw a ghost in Utah." He was smarter than that. He was a threat analyst. He knew how to speak the language of the Pentagon, and he knew that to get funding, you don't sell curiosity. You sell fear. You sell supremacy. He met with Reid. He looked the majority leader in the eye, and he laid it out. He told him about the ranch. He told him about the technology, but he framed it as a challenge. He effectively said, Senator, there is technology operating in U.S. airspace that defies our understanding of physics. It is faster than us. It is stealthier than us. And we don't know who it belongs to. He invoked the specter of the superpowers. He pointed out the obvious. If the Russians or the Chinese figure out how to manipulate gravity before we do, the game is over. The United States ceases to be a superpower overnight. If an enemy can turn off a nuclear missile from orbit, or fly an invisible craft into the White House, our entire defense infrastructure is worthless. Reed got it. He didn't blink. He understood that this wasn't about little green men. It was about maintaining the technological edge. But Reed knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed cover. He needed allies who could move money in the dark without raising eyebrows. He reached out to two of his colleagues, two men who were legends in the Senate, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii and Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska. These three men, Reed, Inouye, and Stevens, were the gang of three when it came to the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. They controlled the black budget, the billions of dollars spent on classified programs that don't appear in the public ledger. They met in a secure room in the Capitol. This is a scene right out of a political thriller. Three old men, veterans of political wars, sitting around a table, deciding to hunt for UFOs. Senator Ted Stevens was going to be the hardest sell. He was a gruff, no-nonsense Republican. But when the topic came up, Stevens didn't laugh. He leaned forward, and he told the group a story from World War II. He said that when he was a pilot flying over the Pacific, he had been paced by a Foo fighter, a glowing ball of light that followed his plane, mimicked his maneuvers, and then vanished. He had never reported it. He was afraid they would ground him, but he had never forgotten it either. He looked at Reed and said, "I've been waiting for this opportunity since the 1940s. The deal was struck. They agreed to authorize $22 million in funding. This wasn't a massive amount by Pentagon standards. It was a rounding error in the defense bill, but it was enough to build a fortress. They needed a name. They couldn't call it the UFO Project. That would invite ridicule. They needed something boring, something dense, something that would make a journalist's eyes glaze over if they saw it on a budget line item. They called it AAWSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications Program. Listen to that name, Weapon System Applications. It sounds like a study on new missile fins, or a procurement contract for better ball bearings. It is the perfect camouflage. It hides the most exotic research in human history inside the dull gray wrapper of bureaucratic jargon. But the name was also honest. Lacatski intended to find out if this technology could be applied to weapon systems. If you can warp space-time to fly a craft, you can warp space-time to deliver a warhead. The mandate was clear. Study the phenomenon, figure out how it works, and see if we can build it. With the money secured, Lacatski went to work. He was now the program manager of the largest official UFO study in U.S. history, but he couldn't run it out of a cubicle at the DIA. He needed a contractor. He needed a private entity that could hire scientists, secure facilities, and operate outside the rigid constraints of the government personnel system. The contract went out for bid. It was a strange solicitation. It asked for a contractor who could study breakthrough technologies and threats out to the year 2050. It asked for expertise in areas that didn't technically exist yet. There was only one company that really fit the bill: Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, Robert Bigelow's new company. It was a perfect loop. Lacatski had started this journey at Bigelow's ranch. Now Bigelow's company would be the engine of the investigation. Bigelow built a secure facility in Las Vegas. He hired 50 people. This wasn't a ragtag group. He hired PhD physicists, biochemists, former intelligence officers, and he hired career law enforcement investigators. He built a team that looked like a cross between a university physics department and a SWAT team. Lacatski gave them their marching orders. He didn't tell them to just look for lights in the sky. He gave them a specific 12-point mandate. These were the 12 technical areas of AAWSAP. If you want to understand the ambition of this program, you have to look at this list. This is the intellectual heart of the project. They weren't just looking for evidence. They were looking for blueprints. They looked at lift. How does a craft fly without wings? They studied propulsion and control. How do you steer a ship that moves at Mach 20 and makes right-angle turns? Is the control interface physical, or is it psychic? They investigated power generation and spatial temporal translation, which is the polite way of saying warp drive and wormholes. They analyzed materials, looking for metamaterials engineered at the atomic level to bend light and radar. They studied configuration and structure, trying to understand why these craft are shaped like saucers, triangles, or Tic Tacs. They looked into signature reduction, invisibility, and the human interface. One of the most critical areas was human effects. This was the category Lacatski fought for. What happens to a human being who gets too close? What are the biological consequences of standing next to a warp drive? They even had a category for armament and a catch-all for peripheral areas: the ghosts, the cryptids, and the high strangeness. This list was a declaration of intent. Lacatski was saying, "We are going to reverse engineer the gods. We are going to take the magic out of the mystery and turn it into engineering." The goal was explicit: to replicate any such advanced characteristics and performance. Think about the audacity of that. They weren't just trying to confirm aliens existed. They were trying to steal their tech. They wanted to build a US version of the Tic Tac. The program officially launched in September 2008. They were flooded with data. They built a massive database called Capella. It became the largest repository of UFO data in the world. They didn't just collect stories. They collected radar tracks, medical records, soil samples, and metamaterial fragments. Lacatski managed it all from his office at the DIA. He was the bridge between the wild frontier of Las Vegas and the rigid hierarchy of the Pentagon. He had to walk a tightrope every day. He had to keep the money flowing. He had to keep the senators happy. And he had to keep the program hidden from the immune system of the bureaucracy, the antibodies within the Pentagon that attack anything they don't understand. One of the first things they did was establish a baseline. You can't study the abnormal if you don't know what the normal is. So Lacatski commissioned a series of technical papers. He called them Defense Intelligence Reference Documents, or DIRDs. He hired the best theoretical physicists in the world. He gave them grants to write about the edge of science. He didn't ask them to write about UFOs. He asked them to write about warp drives. He asked them to write about invisibility cloaking. He asked them to write about space-time metric engineering and traversable wormholes. He was building a library of theoretical physics that would allow his analysts to understand what they were seeing in the field. If an analyst saw a craft disappear, they could pull the dirt on invisibility cloaking and see if the physics matched the observation. He was creating a Rosetta Stone for the impossible. But while the physicists were writing papers, the investigators were in the field, confronting a reality that refused to be academic. The program wasn't just looking at the ranch. They were looking everywhere. And almost immediately, they stumbled onto a case that would become the cornerstone of modern UFO disclosure. In late 2008, a new hire at Bass, a former Marine fighter pilot named Doug Kurth, walked into Colm Kelleher's office. Kurth was a serious man, a combat veteran. He had been the commanding officer of the Marine Hornet Squadron aboard the USS Nimitz in 2004. He told Kelleher a story. He said that back in November 2004, during a training exercise off the coast of San Diego, his squadron had encountered something. He described the Tic Tac. He described a white oblong object about 40 feet long with no wings, no exhaust, and no visible means of propulsion. He described how it hovered over the water, turning the sea into a frothing cauldron. He described how Commander Dave Fravor engaged it, and how the object defied the laws of inertia, accelerating from a standstill to supersonic speeds in the blink of an eye. He described how it vanished from Fravor's sight and reappeared 60 miles away at their secret cap point, their rendezvous location, in seconds. This was exactly what Lacatski was looking for. This wasn't a ghost story on a ranch. This was a military encounter involving the most advanced sensor platforms in the world. The USS Princeton, an Aegis cruiser with the most powerful radar on the planet, had tracked these objects descending from space from 80,000 feet to sea level in less than a second. Lacatski put his best man on it. He assigned Jonathan Axelrod, the same man who had read the book in Baghdad, to investigate the Nimitz case. Axelrod went to work. He used his clearance and his credentials to track down the pilots. He interviewed Fravor. He interviewed the radar operators. He gathered the data. He built a report that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the U.S. Navy had engaged a technology that was vastly superior to anything in the American arsenal. The analysis was chilling. The object demonstrated instantaneous acceleration. It demonstrated hypersonic velocity without signatures. It demonstrated transmedium travel, the ability to fly in space, in the atmosphere, and underwater with equal ease. When they ran the numbers, using the radar data to calculate the g-forces involved, the results were impossible. The object was pulling hundreds, maybe thousands of Gs. A human pilot blacks out at 9 Gs. An F-18 airframe snaps at 13 or 14 Gs. This object was robust enough to survive forces that would flatten a tank, and it did it without making a sound. No sonic boom, no heat signature. Lacatski looked at the report. This was the validation of his entire program. This was the threat. If the Chinese had this, the war was already over. If the Russians had this, they owned the sky. But the characteristics were so extreme, so far beyond the next generation projections, that it pointed to something else. It pointed to the uncomfortable truth that Lacatski had sensed in that kitchen in Utah. This wasn't us, and it probably wasn't them. But as the program ramped up, as the data poured in, something strange began to happen. The investigation was designed to study the phenomenon, but the phenomenon, it seemed, was studying them back. The scientists and intelligence officers who visited the ranch, the men and women who analyzed the data, began to report things. They weren't just observing anomalies in the field, they were bringing them home. It started small. A shadow in the corner of a bedroom in Virginia, a strange noise in a hallway in Maryland, a nightmare that wouldn't end. But then it got worse, much worse. The AAWSAP team realized they had made a critical error. They had treated the phenomenon like a machine. They had treated it like a foreign adversary, something you could observe, measure, and analyze from a safe distance. But this adversary didn't respect distance. It didn't respect security clearances. It didn't respect the walls of a skiff or the sanctuary of a suburban home. Lacatski had set a trap to catch a technological threat, but he hadn't realized that the trap worked both ways. By opening the door to the impossible, he had allowed the impossible to walk through, and now it was following his people home. We call it the Hitchhiker Effect, and it is possibly the single most terrifying discovery of the entire program. It suggests that the phenomenon is not just a craft you see in the sky. It is also a contagion, and once you look at it, it looks back, and it doesn't stop looking when you decide to clock out. We usually think of war as lines on a map. We point and say, here is the green zone, and here is the red zone. We tell ourselves that if we leave the battlefield, if we fly 5,000 miles home, the war stays behind. We believe in the safety of distance. We convince ourselves that the monsters we fight in the desert cannot follow us to the suburbs of Virginia. But what if the enemy isn't a soldier? What if the enemy is a frequency, a signal that latches onto your consciousness like a virus latches onto a cell? Dr. James Lacatski and his team spent millions of dollars trying to define the threat of unidentified aerial phenomena. They were looking for propulsion systems. They were hunting for warp drives and the ultimate weapon of the skies. But while they were looking up, they missed the shadow creeping in through the back door. They made a huge mistake. They assumed the phenomenon was stuck in one place. They thought Skinwalker Ranch was just a haunted house, that if you walked out the gate, you were safe. They were wrong. The program discovered something that terrified them more than any Russian missile or Chinese drone. They discovered that the phenomenon is contagious. It doesn't just haunt a location, it haunts a person. It infects the observer. And once you are infected, you become a carrier. You bring it home to your wife. You bring it home to your children. This is how the greatest secret of the Pentagon followed the secret keepers home. To understand this, we have to go back to the man we call Jonathan Axelrod. Axelrod was not easily frightened. He was a senior aerospace engineer in naval intelligence. He was a man who had walked the halls of the Pentagon and the dusty streets of Baghdad. He dealt in hard facts and classified hardware. He was the lead investigator on the Nimitz Tic Tac case. He knew these machines were real. To him, it was a technical puzzle, a matter of engineering and physics. In July 2009, Axelrod traveled to Skinwalker Ranch with 2 colleagues. They went there to assess the threat. They brought night vision goggles, thermal imagers, and the confidence of men who believe they are in control. They stood in the dark, surrounded by the deep silence of the basin. And they found something, or rather something found them. One night, while walking a dirt track, The three men hit a wall of fear. It wasn't just nervousness, it was a primal biological terror that hit them like a physical wave. They froze. Through his night vision scope, one of the men saw it. Standing in the middle of the path, about 50 yards ahead, it was a black oval. It wasn't a shadow. It was a void, a hole in the world where the green light of the night vision simply ceased to exist. It radiated pure evil. The three hardened military men turned around and walked away fast. As they retreated, the fear lifted like a heavy coat being taken off. They left the ranch a few days later, flew back to the East Coast, and returned to their offices and families in Washington, D.C. They thought the mission was over. They thought they had left the spooky stuff in the desert. But 10 days later, Axelrod called his boss in Las Vegas. He didn't sound like a senior intelligence officer. He sounded shaken. He said, "It followed me." Axelrod lived in a quiet, wealthy suburb of Virginia. It was a place of manicured lawns and safe streets. But inside his house, the laws of physics were breaking down. It started with his wife, Ruth. A few nights after Axelrod returned, Ruth woke up to see a figure standing by the bed. It wasn't her husband. It was a large, black, humanoid shape, a silhouette cut out of the darkness. When she turned on the light, it was gone. She tried to tell herself it was a dream. But 10 minutes later, she heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. She walked to the landing, but the house was empty. Her husband and sons were asleep, yet the feeling of a presence was overwhelming. It was the same feeling Axelrod had felt on the ranch, the feeling of being watched by something that does not like you. The infection was spreading. It wasn't just coming for Axelrod, it was coming for his family. One night, his 16-year-old son woke up screaming. He was a tough, athletic kid, but he was cowering in his bed. He told his mother that he saw orbs in his room. These weren't specks of dust, these were balls of blue light, about the size of softballs, flying with intelligent control. They were buzzing him, diving at him like angry wasps, accompanied by smaller red orbs. A high-level government official goes to a secret ranch to study UFOs. He sees a black void. He comes home, and 2 weeks later, his teenage son is being dive-bombed by glowing spheres in his bedroom in Virginia. This destroys the nuts and bolts theory. Secret Russian aircraft don't follow you home to haunt your kids. Soviet spy planes don't turn into ghosts in your kitchen. This was the Hitchhiker Effect. The phenomenon acted like a virus. Axelrod was the index case. He caught the bug at the ranch and infected his family, and the symptoms were getting worse. One night, Ruth looked out her kitchen window into the backyard. Standing at the edge of the trees was a wolf. But it wasn't a normal wolf, it was huge. And it was standing on 2 legs. It looked right at her, not like an animal, but like a man. It had a casual, arrogant posture. It stared at her with eyes that burned with intelligence. Then it pushed itself off the tree and walked away on 2 legs. Ruth didn't tell anyone. She thought she was losing her mind. How do you tell your husband that there is a werewolf in the garden? But a few days later, on a bright Saturday morning, her sons were watching cartoons when one of them yelled, "Mom, there's a wolf in the yard." Both boys saw it, a massive creature standing upright staring at the house. As they watched, it turned and ran on 2 legs with a speed that shouldn't be possible. When they went out to look, they didn't find footprints. They found claw marks, deep gouges in the tree bark, 7 feet off the ground. This was the reality of the program. While scientists wrote papers about warp drives, the families of the investigators were living in a horror movie. The team had to face a terrifying question. Is the investigation itself dangerous? By looking at the phenomenon, were they inviting it in? They realized they were dealing with social contagion. It moved through families like a disease. If you visited the ranch, you were exposed. If you spent time with someone who visited, you were at risk. And it wasn't just scary. It was physical. It was biological. This brings us to the case of Ron Becker. Becker wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was a brilliant biotechnologist. In 2005, he had an experience that changed how the government looked at UFOs forever. He was driving fast on a highway in Oregon with his daughter asleep in the passenger seat. Suddenly, 3 bright blue orbs appeared in the field next to him, dancing in the air. As soon as Becker focused on them, they stopped dancing. They turned and flew straight at his car. This wasn't a sighting, it was an attack. 2 orbs flew right at the windshield. Becker braced for an explosion, but the orbs didn't break the glass. They passed right through it. They phased through the solid matter of the car. One orb flew across the dashboard. The second orb flew directly at Becker. It didn't swerve. It hit him. It entered his right shoulder, passed through his chest, exited his left shoulder, and flew out the side window. His daughter woke up screaming as she saw the light exit her father's body. Becker felt a coldness spreading through him, a deep cellular freeze. He felt like every cell in his body was vibrating at the wrong frequency. That night, he had a vivid nightmare where a strange voice told him, "We are going to fix this." The next morning, the hair on the left side of his head, where the orb exited, was falling out. He started to get sick. His immune system began to collapse. 18 months later, Ron Becker, a marathon runner in perfect health, was diagnosed with cancer. It was a rare form of breast cancer, extremely uncommon in men. The tumor was located exactly in the path the blue orb had taken through his chest. The medical team analyzed the data and concluded the cancer was biologically consistent with the cause and effect temporal relationship. Translation: the UFO gave him cancer. This changed everything. This was now a public health threat. The phenomenon could manipulate matter, pass through solid glass and human tissue, and leave behind a signature of radiation and cellular destruction. Becker wasn't the only one. Jim Costigan, the Marine who saw the black oval, was later walking with his wife when a blue orb flew past them and grazed her shoulder. She didn't feel it then, but within weeks she developed a severe autoimmune disease. Her body started attacking itself. This was the pattern. The Hitchhiker Effect was biological warfare. It was an attack on the human immune system. The program realized they were dealing with a technology that could interact with biology at the molecular level. If an enemy has a drone that can fly through a wall and give a target a fatal tumor, that is the ultimate assassination weapon. It leaves no bullet, no poison, just a sick man who dies of natural causes a year later. They had to pivot. They hired doctors and immunologists. They created a secret medical database. They found that the phenomenon targeted the immune system, causing autoimmune disorders, strange cancers, and neurological damage. And it wasn't random. The intelligence behind it seemed to select its targets, punishing those who got too close or were too arrogant. Remember Juliet Witt? She was a brilliant analyst and a skeptic. She laughed at the stories. After visiting the ranch, she went home to Virginia, and her life fell apart. Objects flew off shelves, and wine bottles smashed against walls until she was broken by the invasion of her sanctuary. The phenomenon followed her home to teach her a lesson. The Pentagon generals didn't know how to handle this. They understood tanks and bombs. They did not understand a weapon that follows you home to haunt your children or gives you cancer with a ball of light. It was too weird for the briefing room. If you told the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General, "We have a problem with werewolves in Virginia," you would be laughed out of the room. So the data was buried. But Dr. Lacatski knew the truth. He realized the nuts and bolts craft, the saucers and Tic Tacs, were just the delivery mechanism. They were the syringe. The real payload was the infection. The question that haunted him was, is this intentional? Is the Hitchhiker Effect a weapon? Is it a defense mechanism, like a skunk spraying a predator? Or is it something even more alien? Maybe the phenomenon is so energetic that merely being near it is toxic to humans, like standing next to an exposed nuclear core. Maybe we are just allergic to its reality. Or maybe it is a test. Maybe the phenomenon is poking us to see how we react, like a lab technician poking a rat in a cage. And we were failing the test. We were getting sick, scared, and retreating. By 2010, the team knew they needed a new kind of physics to fight back. They needed to understand how a craft could manipulate space-time to become invisible, pass through solid matter, and manipulate the human mind. This led to the most ambitious intellectual project in intelligence history, Project Physics. They didn't just want to observe the ghosts. They wanted to build the machine that made them, and they were getting closer than you think. We have witnessed the horror. We have seen the physical toll this secret takes on the human body, the sickness, the injuries, the shadows lingering in the bedroom. We have seen what happens when the phenomenon touches us. It destroys. But Dr. James Lacatski was not a biologist. He was a rocket scientist. He was a man of ballistics, trajectories, and cold, hard numbers. When he looked at the data coming out of the AAWSAP program, he didn't see a ghost story. He saw an engineering problem. He saw a machine. He saw a craft that could plummet from the edge of space to sea level in less than a second. He saw an object hover without rotors and accelerate without leaving a trail of exhaust. He saw technology that treated the laws of physics, laws we have obeyed since Isaac Newton, as mere suggestions. Lacatski realized that to understand the threat, he had to ignore the ghosts. He had to ignore the strangeness. He had to strip away the fear and look at the math. He asked a simple, terrifying question. If I wanted to build a UFO, how would I do it? This question birthed the intellectual heart of the entire program. It was called Project Physics. This wasn't a study of mysterious lights in the sky. It was a Manhattan Project for the 21st century. Lacatski commissioned a series of 38 technical papers. He called them Defense Intelligence Reference Documents. He didn't hire ufologists to write them. He hired the best theoretical physicists in the world. He hired the men and women working at the bleeding edge of academia and national defense. He gave them grants. He gave them security clearances. And he gave them a mandate. Tell us how the impossible is possible. He didn't ask them to prove aliens existed. He asked them to write the blueprints for their ships. Tonight we open those documents. We look at the papers the Defense Intelligence Agency paid for. We look at the physics of warp drives, invisibility cloaking, and space-time metric engineering. We will see that the government wasn't just chasing shadows. They were trying to reverse engineer the gods. To understand Project Physics, you have to understand the problem Lacatski was trying to solve. It's called the observable. When the pilots of the USS Nimitz saw the Tic Tac object, they witnessed 5 distinct behaviors that defied our understanding of aerospace engineering. First, anti-gravity lift. No wings, no rotors, yet it stays in the air, defying gravity effortlessly. Second, sudden and instantaneous acceleration. It went from 0 to Mach 10 in a heartbeat. Third, hypersonic velocities without signatures. No sonic boom, no heat trail. It moves silently through the sky. Fourth, low observability. It disappears from radar. It becomes invisible to the naked eye. Fifth, transmedium travel. It flies in the vacuum of space. It flies in the atmosphere. It flies underwater. It does all 3 without changing shape or slowing down. Lacatski took these 5 observables and handed them to his physicists. He said, "Explain this." The result was a stack of papers that reads like science fiction but is grounded in hard, brutal math. Let's start with the most famous Defense Intelligence Reference document. It was titled Warp Drive, Dark Energy, and the Manipulation of Extra Dimensions. We hear warp drive and think of Star Trek, we think of TV shows, but in the halls of the Pentagon, warp drive is a serious concept. It is based on a real solution, Einstein's math known as the Alcubierre metric. Here is the physics. You cannot travel through space faster than the speed of light. That is the cosmic speed limit. If you try, you become infinitely heavy, and you need infinite energy to move. Einstein was very clear on this. But Einstein also said that space itself is flexible. Space can stretch. Space can contract. The Defense Intelligence Reference document proposed that you don't move the ship through space. You move space around the ship. Imagine a surfer on the ocean. If the surfer tries to paddle with his hands, he moves slowly. He is limited by his own muscles. But if he catches a wave, the water moves him. He stands still on the board, but the wave pushes him forward at incredible speed. The warp drive does the same thing. It creates a wave of space-time. It compresses the space in front of the ship, pulling the destination closer, and it expands the space behind the ship, pushing the starting point away. The ship sits inside a warp bubble. Inside that bubble, space is flat. It is calm. The ship isn't moving locally. It is riding the wave of distorted reality. This explains the impossible G-forces. When the Tic Tac accelerated from a hover to thousands of miles an hour in a second, the pilot inside should have been turned into jelly. The pressure would be hundreds of times the force of gravity. But if the craft is using a warp drive, there are 0 G-forces. Why? Because the craft didn't move. The space around it moved. The pilot inside feels nothing. He could be sipping a cup of coffee while accelerating at Mach 20, and the liquid wouldn't even ripple. This was the revelation of Project Physics. The UFOs aren't defying the laws of physics. They are mastering them. They are engineering the very fabric of space and time. But speed was only half the problem. The other problem was stealth. Dr. Lacatski had stood in that kitchen in Utah and seen a yellow tubular object that was semi-opaque. It wasn't solid like steel. It wasn't clear like glass. It looked like a dense fog or a hologram. It looked fuzzy. For years, people thought this was a ghost, but the project physics team realized it was a machine in operation. They commissioned a Defense Intelligence Reference document titled Invisibility Cloaking, Theory and Experiments. This paper explored the cutting edge of material science, focusing on something called metamaterials. A metamaterial isn't a chemical compound you dig out of the ground. It is a structure. It is engineered at the atomic level. It is designed to interact with light and radar in ways that natural materials cannot. We see things because light bounces off them and hits our eyes. If I shine a flashlight at a wall, the light bounces back. What if the light flowed around the object, like water flowing around a rock in a stream? If you stand in a river and put a rock in the water splits, goes around the rock, and joins back together on the other side. If you look downstream, the water looks undisturbed. You wouldn't know the rock was there. The Defense Intelligence Reference document explained that a craft coated in the right metamaterials could do the same thing with light. It could bend the light waves around the hull. The light from behind the craft would flow around it and continue to your eye. You wouldn't see the craft. You would see what was behind it. This explains the semi-opaque quality Lacatski saw. The yellow tube wasn't a ghost. It was a machine with its cloaking device engaged, but perhaps not perfectly tuned. It was bending the light, but there was some scattering, some distortion. It looked fuzzy because the light waves were being manipulated in real time. It was a visual artifact of a gravitational redshift. When a craft generates the massive energy field required for lift, it distorts the light around it. It shifts the light spectrum. A craft might glow blue as it powers up, then fade to invisible as the field stabilizes. The physicists realized that the glow of a UFO isn't decoration. It is the ionization of the air caused by the tremendous energy of the propulsion drive. It is the exhaust of a warp engine. This brings us to the most dangerous question of all. The question that kept Lacatski awake at night. Where does the power come from? To warp space-time, to bend light, to accelerate a 40-foot object to hypersonic speeds, you need energy. Massive amounts of energy. You need the output of a nuclear reactor. But the Tic Tac had no air intakes. It had no exhaust. It had no fuel tanks. It had no heat signature. If you put a thermal camera on a jet engine, it glows white hot. The Tic Tac was cold. It was the same temperature as the air around it. This was the technological void. The craft appeared to be empty. It was a shell, a geometry. There was no room for a reactor. There was no room for batteries. So where is the juice? The project physics team commissioned a Defense Intelligence Reference document titled Concepts for Extracting Energy from the Quantum Vacuum. This is the Holy Grail. This is the secret that could save the world or destroy it. We are taught that a vacuum is empty space. If you take a box and suck all the air out, there is nothing left. Quantum physics says, wrong. The vacuum is not empty. It is seething with energy. It is alive with virtual particles popping in and out of existence. It is an ocean of potential power. We call it zero-point energy or ZPE. Imagine a cup of coffee. You drink the coffee. The cup is empty, but the cup is sitting on a table, and the table is sitting on the earth, and the earth is spinning through space at 67,000 miles per hour. The empty cup still possesses massive energy because of its motion. The quantum vacuum is the background energy of the universe itself. It is everywhere. It is inside the atoms of your body. It is in the empty space between the stars. The physicists theorized that the UFOs aren't carrying fuel. They are harvesting it. They are open system. They dip into the quantum vacuum and pull out the energy they need on demand. They are swimming in a sea of gasoline, and they have figured out how to ignite it. This explains why they never land to refuel. It explains why they can hover for days. They have an infinite power supply. But it also implies something terrifying about the craft itself. If the craft is a ZPE harvester, then the hull isn't just a skin. The hull is the engine. The metamaterials of the skin are designed to resonate with the vacuum energy. They act as a waveguide. They channel the energy from the fabric of reality directly into the propulsion system. This is why the crash retrieval program is so difficult. You can't just take the engine out. The entire craft is a single integrated solid-state device. To understand the engine, you have to understand the atomic structure of the metal itself. This is the secret of the metamaterials. Lacatski hinted at this. He spoke of layered magnesium bismuth samples, materials engineered at the micron level. layers of metal thinner than a human hair pressed together in ways our factories cannot replicate. These aren't just strong metals, they are waveguides. They are designed to manipulate the invisible frequencies of the quantum vacuum. So, they had the theory. They had the physics papers, and they had the math that proved warp drive and invisibility cloaking were possible. But they had something else. They had the Tic Tac. The investigation of the Nimitz encounter wasn't just a sighting report. It was a stress test for these theories. The team took the radar data from the USS Princeton. They fed it into the computer models. They asked the question, does the movement of the Tic Tac match the math of a warp drive? The answer was yes. The lack of sonic boom, explained by the warp bubble. The air isn't being pushed out of the way, it is flowing around the bubble. The instant acceleration, explained by the space-time metric. The craft isn't moving, space is moving. The transmedium travel, explained by the vacuum energy. The drive doesn't rely on aerodynamics. It works the same in a vacuum, in air, or in water. It ignores the medium because it manipulates the geometry of the universe. This was the triumph of Project Physics. They had bridged the gap between the ghost stories and the hard science. They had proven that the UFO was not magic, it was technology. But this victory came with a chilling realization. If the physics are valid, then the technology is buildable. And if it is buildable, then someone has built it. It wasn't us. The US military was still using jet fuel. We were still pushing air with fans. We were Stone Age compared to this. Lacatski looked at the geopolitical landscape. He knew what our adversaries were doing. He knew their capabilities. They were behind us in stealth. They were behind us in engines. It didn't make sense that they would leapfrog us by 1,000 years in secret. But then they found something that shook that assumption. They found the Russian Thread 3 document. While Lacatski was commissioning papers in Washington, his team was translating secret documents from the Soviet Union. They discovered that the Russians hadn't just been watching, they had been hunting. And their data mirrored the US data almost exactly. They saw the same shapes, they tracked the same speeds, they recorded the same impossible maneuvers. But the Russians had come to a darker conclusion. They didn't just think it was technology, they thought it was a weapon. The Project Physics papers proved that the Tic Tac was the ultimate platform. If you put a warhead on a warp drive, there is no defense. You can't shoot it down, you can't track it. It can appear over Washington, D.C., drop a payload, and vanish before the air raid sirens even turn on. Lacatski realized the race wasn't just to understand the physics. The race was to weaponize it. The 38 Defense Intelligence Reference documents weren't just academic papers. They were the instruction manual for the next generation of warfare. They were the blueprints for ultimate supremacy. We have spent time in the laboratory. We've looked at the complicated math behind warp drives and the strange biology of contagion. We've walked the busy halls of the Pentagon and the quiet bedrooms of the suburbs. But to truly understand the size of the threat Dr. James Lacatski was tracking, we have to leave the world of theory behind. We have to go to the front lines. We have to go to the places where the United States keeps its apocalypse. During the Cold War, we built a shield. We dug deep holes in the ground in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. We poured millions of tons of concrete and installed blast doors thick enough to survive the end of the world. Inside those dark holes, we placed the Minuteman missiles. These are the Sentinels. They are the ultimate guarantee of American safety. If everything else fails, if our armies are beaten and our cities are burning, the Minuteman missiles rise from the earth to ensure the enemy goes down with us. They are the most protected, most secure, most deadly machines ever built by human hands, and the phenomenon treats them like toys. This was the darkest realization of the program. While the public was distracted by stories of lights in the sky and crop circles, the intelligence community was sitting on a secret that terrified the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The UFOs weren't just watching us, they were disarming us. Lacatski created a special project to investigate this. He called it Project Northern Tier. The goal was simple. Look at every single time an unidentified aerial phenomenon interacted with a nuclear weapon facility. Look for the pattern and look for the intent. What they found was not a bunch of random sightings. It was a planned campaign to break in and interfere. Let's go back to the incident that defined the threat. It is the ghost story of the nuclear age. Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, March 1967. Deep underground, in a launch control center, two officers sat in front of their consoles. They controlled a flight of 10 nuclear missiles. These weapons were on alert status. That means they were live. They were ready to fly. Above ground, security teams patrolled the fence line. It was a clear, cold night, the kind of night where the stars look like chips of ice. Suddenly, the phone rang in the capsule. The guard upstairs was panicking. He reported a light, a bright, glowing red orb. It wasn't an airplane, and it wasn't a helicopter. It was hovering silently, right over the front gate. The officers underground didn't know what to make of it. They told the guard to keep watching. Then the orb moved. It didn't fly away. It flew directly over the missile silo. And then, the impossible happened. Down in the capsule, the boards lit up. Sirens blared. The lights on the console turned from green to red. One by one, the missiles went offline. They were disabled. The guidance and control systems simply shut down. In seconds, 10 nuclear missiles, the pride of the U.S. Air Force, the most advanced weapons on Earth, were turned into 10 useless metal tubes in the ground. The object hovered for a moment longer, then vanished at impossible speed. As soon as it left, the missiles came back online. The Air Force investigated everything. They checked the wiring, they checked the software, they checked for power surges. They found nothing. There was no physical reason for the shutdown. The only variable was the red orb hovering over the silo. This wasn't a one-time thing. A week later, it happened at another launch facility. Another 10 missiles dropped offline. Lacatski and his team pulled the files on this. They looked at what the witnesses said. They looked at the technical reports. They realized that this wasn't just a glitch. It was a demonstration. Whatever was controlling that orb had the ability to enter our most secure airspace, hover over our most dangerous weapons, and turn them off like a light switch. It was a message. It was saying, "Your most powerful weapon is useless against us. We can turn you off whenever we want." This is the definition of a strategic threat. If an enemy can neutralize your nuclear defense, the balance of power is destroyed. But they found that the rabbit hole went deeper. It wasn't just shutting them down. Sometimes it turned them on. There are reports in the deep files, reports that Project Northern Tier investigated, of the launch sequences starting on their own while an object hovered overhead. The officers inside the capsule had to scramble to override the system, literally racing to stop World War III from starting by accident. Think about what that means. We assume that the President of the United States controls the nuclear codes. We assume there is a chain of command, but the phenomenon showed that it has root access to our operating system. It can lock us out. It can let us in. It can potentially pull the trigger for us. This is the terrifying reality that was the engine that drove AAWSAP's urgency. This is why Senators Reid, Inouye, and Stevens were willing to pay for the program. They weren't paying to find aliens. They were paying to find out who had the keys to our arsenal. But the investigation didn't stop with history. Investigators found that the break-ins were still happening. Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota, March 2010. While the AAWSAP team was active, a staff sergeant at Dakota Air Traffic Control contacted them. He reported a radar track, an unidentified traffic crossing the path of a military aircraft. The pilot saw it. He reported visual contact. The object had no transponder to identify itself. It had no altitude beacon. It was flying at 2,000 feet, right in the operational airspace of the base. Then it vanished. It disappeared from radar. It disappeared from sight. Minutes later, it reappeared, behind the aircraft tracking it. The AAWSAP investigators managed to get the cockpit transcripts. They confirmed the event. In 2010, 40 years after Malmstrom, the objects were still testing the fence. They were still playing cat and mouse with the U.S. military. This was active surveillance, and it wasn't limited to the American Midwest. Dr. Lacatski knew that if the phenomenon was real, it wouldn't just be an American problem, it would be a global one. And the one nation that had a nuclear arsenal comparable to the United States was the Soviet Union. He tasked his team with a daring intelligence play. He wanted to know what the Russians knew. Through contacts developed by investigative journalist George Knapp, AAWSAP obtained a treasure trove of documents. They were known as the Russian Thread, 3 files. These were not rumors. These were official documents from the Soviet Ministry of Defense. They detailed a massive, secret study of abnormal aerospace phenomena conducted by the Soviet military from 1991 onwards. They hired translators. They sat in the secure facility in Las Vegas, reading through thousands of pages of text, and what they found was a mirror image of their own nightmare. The Soviets were terrified. They had created a specific military unit, Unit 73790, to track and analyze the phenomenon. Their data was huge. It dwarfed anything the US had publicly admitted to. The Russians had recorded thousands of sightings, they had radar tracks, they had pilot reports, and they had confirmed the same shapes, discs, cylinders, triangles. But the Russian experience had a sharper edge. In the US, the encounters were often passive, lights in the sky, disabled missiles. In the Soviet Union, the encounters were kinetic, that means violent. Documents detailed dogfights, Russian fighter jets engaging UFOs, pilots firing missiles, and the UFOs firing back. There were reports of aircraft being destroyed, pilots vanishing, planes falling out of the sky with their electronics fried. The Russians had come to a stark conclusion. They didn't view the phenomenon as a scientific curiosity. They viewed it as a hostile force. They viewed it as a threat to the survival of the Soviet state. They had the same problem with their nuclear sites. The Thread 3 papers described UFOs hovering over Soviet missile bases in Ukraine and Russia. They described missiles activating on their own. The Soviet leadership was paralyzed by the fear that the Americans had developed a secret weapon, or that a third party was trying to trigger a nuclear war between the superpowers. This was the Soviet mirror. Lacatski looked at the US data and the Russian data side by side. The match was perfect. The same capabilities, the same interest in nuclear weapons, the same ability to do whatever they wanted without consequence. It forced a whole new way of thinking. The Cold War hadn't been a two-way standoff. It had been a three-way game. Player 1, the United States. Player 2, the Soviet Union. Player 3, the interlopers. Player 3 had been watching the whole time. Player 3 had been manipulating both sides. Player 3 had been turning the lights on and off in the silos, reminding the superpowers that they were not the top predators on this planet. One specific case from the AAWSAP files illustrates this global reach perfectly. It involves the Royal Air Force Base Lakenheath incident in the United Kingdom. Investigators analyzed a 2007 event involving U.S. Air Force F-15 Sea Eagle stationed in England. The pilots were on a routine training mission. Suddenly the radar lit up. A target appeared. It was at 17,000 feet. It was moving slowly. The captain turned to intercept. He got a visual. It wasn't a saucer. It wasn't a Tic Tac. It was a black rock. That was the pilot's description, a small, black, rock-like object. No wings, no engine, just a floating stone. The pilots tried to lock on. They used their radar. They used their autoguns mode. But the object didn't care. It didn't try to escape. It didn't run away. It just sat there, defying gravity, ignoring the presence of two of the most advanced fighter jets in the world. The report on Lakenheath is a study in frustration. The pilots couldn't identify it. The radar couldn't classify it. The technology didn't make sense. It was a meteor that didn't fall. This case proved that the phenomenon wasn't just interested in nukes. It was interested in our tactical fighting abilities. It was testing our response times. It was measuring our radar frequencies. It was mining our military for data. Project Northern Tier and the Thread 3 analysis led Lacatski to a chilling idea. The phenomenon follows a pattern of fear. It appears where we are most dangerous. It appears where we concentrate our most destructive energy. Nuclear silos, aircraft carrier strike groups, war zones. But why? Is it peacekeeping? Is it a galactic federation trying to stop us from blowing ourselves up? That is the optimistic view, the space brother theory. But Lacatski was a threat analyst and he didn't believe in space brothers. He looked at the data. When you disarm a soldier, you aren't protecting him. You are making him helpless. When you turn off a nuclear missile, you are weakening the enemy's ability to defend themselves. The behavior of the phenomenon looked exactly like pre-invasion intelligence preparation. If you were going to invade a planet, or at least control it, what is the first thing you would do? You would map their defenses. You would test how fast they respond. You would neutralize their strongest weapons. You would prove to their leaders that they are powerless. That is exactly what the UFOs were doing. They were mapping the silos, they were testing the F-18S. They were neutralizing the nukes. and they were doing it with a technology that we couldn't touch. The 38 Defense Intelligence reference documents of Project Physics explained how they did it. They used warp drives to move, metamaterials to hide, and zero-point energy to power their systems. But Project Northern Tier explained why, or at least it hinted at the why, and the hint was terrifying. They are managing us. We are not the masters of our domain. We are the tenants, and the landlord has the master key. By 2010, the picture was becoming clear. The U.S. government had confirmed the existence of the craft. They had confirmed the advanced physics. They had confirmed the biological effects on humans, and they had confirmed the strategic threat to nuclear weapons. But there was one piece of the puzzle missing. The phenomenon wasn't just interacting with the military. It wasn't just interacting with the scientists. It was interacting with the public. And in some parts of the world, that interaction wasn't just psychological. It was violent. While the Americans were dealing with ghosts and cancer, the people of Brazil were dealing with lasers and blood. The phenomenon wears many masks, but behind every mask there is the same cold, calculating intelligence. And it is watching us. We have witnessed this phenomenon in the freezing deserts of Utah. We have watched it lurk in the sterile missile silos of Montana. We have tracked it through the quiet, manicured suburbs of Virginia. In America, the phenomenon plays a psychological game. It haunts, it teases, and it shuts down our weapons. It acts like a ghost. But Dr. James Lacatski knew a simple truth. A ghost doesn't leave tracks on radar, and a ghost doesn't own a warp drive. Ace, he realized the phenomenon adapts to its environment. It holds up a mirror to the culture it visits. In the United States, a nation obsessed with technology and surveillance, it disguises itself as a drone or a Tic Tac. But what happens when you go somewhere else? What happens when you travel to a place where the veil between the modern world and the ancient world is thin? Lacatski directed his team to look south, to Brazil. In 2009, while the Project Physics team calculated zero-point energy in Las Vegas, AAWSAP sent investigators to the state of Pará, deep in the Amazon basin. They weren't looking for distant lights in the sky. They were hunting for a cold case. They found a case so violent, so physical, and so terrifying that the Brazilian Air Force sealed the files for 30 years. It is known as the Colares incident, but the locals don't call it that. They call it the time of the Chupa Chupa. The year was 1977. The island of Colares sits at the mouth of the Amazon River. It is a place of fishermen and farmers. These are simple people who know the jungle. But in the autumn of 1977, something came out of the sky that defied their understanding. It started with lights. Strange glowing shapes drifted over the treetops. Cylinders, saucers, objects shaped like huge refrigerators. But these lights didn't just hover, they hunted. The villagers reported that the objects descended at night. They fired a beam of light, a focused beam, solid like a laser. The beam hit a person. It was hot. It burned. It felt like a cigarette pressing against the skin. Then paralysis set in. The victims couldn't move. They couldn't scream. They were frozen, pinned to the earth by the light. And while they were trapped, the beam did something to them. It extracted blood. When the light released them, the victims were left weak, shaking, and drained. They had puncture marks on their skin. Small, precise holes, often sitting inside a purple bruise. This wasn't a campfire story. This was a medical crisis. The local doctor was overwhelmed. She treated over 40 patients in just a few months. She saw the burns. She saw the puncture marks. She saw strong men and women so drained of blood they could barely stand up. She took blood samples and found dangerously low iron levels. She found signs of radiation sickness. Loss of hair, nausea, uncontrollable shaking. She wrote reports. She begged the government for help. She said, "We are under attack." The panic was absolute. The villagers stopped sleeping at night. They lit huge bonfires to keep the sky away. They slept huddled in the church. The women and children were evacuated. The men stood guard with old hunting rifles, shooting helplessly at the stars. This was not a sighting. This was a siege. The Brazilian Air Force had to intervene. They launched Operation Plate. They sent a team of intelligence officers led by Captain Hollanda to the island. They brought cameras, they brought radar, they brought the full weight of the military. And the military saw it too. The AAWSAP team obtained the files from Operation Plate. They got the photos, and they got the films. Captain Hollander and his men recorded hundreds of encounters. They watched objects dive into the water. They watched them fly out of the water. They saw massive mothership-sized craft hovering over the river. And they saw the beams. In one report, a soldier aimed his rifle at a light. The object reacted instantly. It fired a beam right back at him. He was knocked unconscious. He woke up hours later, partially paralyzed. The military realized they were helpless. They couldn't shoot it down. They couldn't chase it away. They were just documenting an invasion. After 4 months, the Air Force abruptly shut down the operation. They classified the files. They told the villagers to go back to work. They buried the truth. Captain Hollander spent the rest of his life trying to tell the world what he saw. In 1997, he gave a famous interview detailing the encounters. Weeks later, he was found dead. A belt around his neck ruled a suicide. 30 years later, the AAWSAP team arrived in Brazil. They weren't tourists. They were intelligence professionals with money and credentials. They met with the Brazilian generals. They met with the surviving witnesses. They were looking for a specific data point. They wanted to understand the control mechanism. In the US, the phenomenon relied on psychological manipulation. The Hitchhiker Effect. It messed with your mind. It haunted your house. But in Brazil, the phenomenon was kinetic. It was physical. It was harvesting biological material. Why the difference? Lacatski's analysts developed a theory. The phenomenon treats us differently depending on our technology. In the United States, we are a nuclear power. We have radar. We have jets. So the phenomenon uses stealth. It uses camouflage. It engages in electronic warfare. In 1977 Colares, the villagers had no technology. They had no defense. So the phenomenon didn't bother with stealth. It acted without fear. It treated them like cattle. It was a terrifying realization. The Space Brothers weren't here to save us. They were here to use us. AAWSAP focused heavily on the medical evidence. They interviewed Dr. Waleed. She confirmed everything. She showed them the records. She told them about the Chupa Chupa victims. She described the precision of the wounds. It wasn't a messy animal bite. It was surgical. This aligned perfectly with the data collected in the US. Remember Ron Becker? The blue orb that passed through his chest and left a cancer in its wake. It was the same technology. The same ability to manipulate biology. The same total disregard for human safety. But AAWSAP found something else in Brazil, something even stranger than the attacks. They also found a case of healing. Through their contacts with Brazilian General Paulo Uchoa, a high-ranking official deeply embedded in the UFO research community, the AAWSAP team gained access to a file that defied all logic. It was the case of Bernadette Justiniano Gomes. In the late 1970s, Bernadette was a young woman dying of Chagas disease. Chagas is a parasite. It destroys the heart. There is no cure. Once the heart enlarges, death is inevitable. Bernadette was in the terminal stages. She lay in a military hospital, waiting to die. General Uchoa's father was a legendary figure in Brazil, a mystic, a researcher. He claimed to be in contact with the intelligence behind the UFOs. According to the files obtained by AAWSAP, the general received a telepathic message. The intelligence told him they could save her. This sounds like a fairy tale, but AAWSAP investigated it like a crime scene. They hunted for the records. The story goes that the general removed Bernadette from the hospital against doctor's orders. He took her to a remote farm. A craft appeared. It landed. A humanoid figure emerged, glowing with a blue light. The entity approached the dying woman. It held a device, a syringe-like instrument that glowed with the same blue light. It touched her chest. Bernadette reported intense pain, a burning sensation in her heart. Then the entity left. The craft departed. Bernadette was taken back to the hospital. The doctors examined her. They took x-rays. They ran EKGs. Her heart was normal. The enlargement was gone. The parasite was gone. She was cured. She went on to live a normal life, get married, and have children. AAWSAP obtained the medical records. They confirmed the diagnosis of terminal Chagas, and they confirmed the subsequent clean bill of health. This case posed a fundamental challenge to Lacatski's threat assessment. If the phenomenon can kill you with a beam of light, but also cure you with a beam of light, what is it? It isn't just a weapon, it is a control system. It controls our airspace, it controls our nuclear weapons, and it controls our biology. It can edit us like a writer editing a manuscript. It can delete a disease, or it can insert a cancer. This realization shifted the focus of the program. They weren't just dealing with an adversary. They were dealing with a force that viewed humanity as a biological resource. We are the lab rats. Sometimes they poke us to see if we bite. Sometimes they dissect us. And sometimes, rarely, they cure us. But the power dynamic is always the same. They are the experimenters. We are the subjects. By 2010, AAWSAP had built a comprehensive picture of the phenomenon. They had the physics, they had the biology, they had the global history. They had proof of the threat to nuclear weapons. They had proof of the threat to human health. They had characterized the threat. But in Washington, success is dangerous. While Lacatski hunted UFOs in Brazil and Utah, a different kind of predator woke up inside the Pentagon. The immune system of the bureaucracy detected AAWSAP. There were rivals within the Defense Intelligence Agency, men who didn't have the clearance to know what AAWSAP was doing, but who saw the money going out the door. Men who heard whispers of skinwalkers and ghosts and decided that Lacatski had gone rogue. They didn't care about the data. They didn't care about the 38 technical reports. They didn't care about the threats to the nuclear silos. They saw a program investigating paranormal UFO crap. That was the phrase they used. And they decided to kill it. Dr. Lacatski had built a fortress of secrets, but he left the back gate open. And we are going to see that the greatest threat to the truth wasn't the aliens, it was the humans. By 2010, Dr. James Lacatski and his team had accomplished the impossible. They had built the largest, most comprehensive UFO study in the history of the United States government. They had the radar tracks. They had the medical reports. They had the physics. They had the proof. They had done exactly what the Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid, had asked them to do. They had characterized the threat. But in Washington, D.C., success does not protect you. In Washington, success paints a target on your back. Lacatski had built a fortress of truth, but he had built it inside a tank filled with sharks. And while he was looking up at the stars, those sharks were circling his desk. This is the story of how the program died. It wasn't killed by aliens. It wasn't killed by the Russians. It was killed by a weapon far more efficient than a warp drive. It was killed by a memo. We are going to look at the counterintelligence war. This is the battle that is still being fought today. It is a war over the narrative. It is a war over who gets to define what is real. And the first casualty of this war was the truth. To understand why AAWSAP fell, you have to understand the environment in 2009. The program was a black program. It was funded by a specific pot of money hidden inside the massive budget of the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was protected by three powerful men: Senator Harry Reid, Senator Daniel Inouye, and Senator Ted Stevens. As long as those three stood guard, the money was safe. But in politics, safety is just an illusion. In 2009, Senator Harry Reid was facing a brutal re-election campaign. He was the face of the Democratic Party, and that made him a target. Every move he made was watched. Every dollar he spent was analyzed. Then a rumor started to circulate, a whisper. Reid began to suspect that there was a spy in his office. He believed that someone on his staff, or someone close to the money pipeline, was leaking information to his political enemies. He feared that the AAWSAP program, the UFO project, was going to be used as a weapon against him. Imagine the headline: Senate Majority Leader spends $22 million hunting for werewolves in Utah. It would be the end of his career. It would be the Golden Fleece Award to end all awards for wasting taxpayer money. Reid had to make a tactical retreat. He confided in Lacatski. He told him that he had to pause the funding. He couldn't put the next batch of money into the bill until the election was over and the leak was plugged. He had to protect his seat of power before he could protect the secrets of the universe. It was supposed to be a temporary pause, a strategic freeze. But in the Pentagon, a pause is a death sentence. When the money stopped, the immune system of the bureaucracy woke up. There were men within the Defense Intelligence Agency who hated AAWSAP. They didn't have the high-level clearance to know the full scope of the data. They didn't know about the Tic Tac object. They didn't know about the biological injuries. All they knew was that James Lacatski, a missile analyst, was spending millions of dollars on something they couldn't see. And they heard the rumors. They heard the whispers about skinwalkers and poltergeists. They didn't see the scientific rigor. They didn't see the 38 heavy technical reports on warp drive physics. They saw a weak spot. They launched a campaign of ridicule. They labeled the program with a phrase that would stick to it like tar. They called it paranormal UFO crap. This wasn't just an insult, it was a weapon. In the intelligence community, your reputation is your currency. If you are labeled as the UFO guy, you are bankrupt. You are toxic. The rivals within the Defense Intelligence Agency used the pause and funding to attack the foundation of the program. They argued that it was a waste of taxpayer money. They argued that it wasn't science. They argued that it was a liability. Lacatski fought back. He pointed to the data. He pointed to the threat analysis. He pointed to documents showing the Soviets took this seriously. But you cannot fight prejudice with data. You cannot fight ridicule with math. The antibodies of the Pentagon were swarming. They wanted to purge the infection. They wanted AAWSAP gone. Lacatski knew the walls were closing in. He knew that if he stayed in the Defense Intelligence Agency, the program would be suffocated. He needed a lifeboat. He needed to move the program out of the Department of Defense. He needed to find a new host, a host that was focused on the homeland, a host that cared about border security and intrusions into our airspace. He looked at the Department of Homeland Security. It made sense. The phenomenon was invading U.S. airspace. It was interacting with U.S. citizens. It was causing medical injuries on U.S. soil. This wasn't just a military problem. It was a homeland security problem. Lacatski came up with a plan. He would transfer everything, the database, the personnel, the mission, to the Department of Homeland Security. He gave it a new code name, a name that sounded harmless, a name that sounded like a vacation. He called it Project Kona Blue. This is one of the most misunderstood chapters in the history of disclosure. People think Kona Blue was a failed idea. It wasn't. It was a rescue mission. It was an attempt to save the most important data in the world from being shredded by bureaucrats. Lacatski and his team prepared a pitch. They prepared a briefing that would blow the doors off the Department of Homeland Security. On February 7, 2011, Lacatski walked into the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. He was accompanied by his team, and they were carrying the weight of the secret. They met with two high-level officials, Under Secretary Tara O'Toole and a senior advisor named Sasha Mover. These were serious people. O'Toole was an expert in biodefense. She understood pandemics. She understood invisible threats. Lacatski didn't hold back. He didn't give them the cleaned-up version. He gave them the data dump. He sat at the conference table and he laid it all out. He told them about the Tic Tac. He told them about the warp drives. He told them about the nuclear silos. And then he told them about the ranch. He told them about the creatures. He told them about the orbs. He told them about the biological effects, the cancers, the immune system failures, the terror. He spoke for hours. It was arguably the most intense, harrowing explanation of paranormal reality ever delivered in a U.S. government facility. O'Toole and Mover were stunned. They were shell-shocked. They sat there listening to a high-ranking intelligence officer tell them that wolf-like creatures were real and that UFOs were giving people cancer. But they didn't laugh. They were scientists. They looked at the data. They looked at the medical reports. And they saw the pattern. They were interested. They saw the potential. They saw that this technology, if mastered, could change the world. And they saw the threat. If these things could penetrate our airspace at will, Homeland Security needed to know. The meeting ended, and Lacatski left feeling hopeful. He thought he had found a sanctuary. He thought Kona Blue was a go. But he had forgotten the Hitchhiker Effect. You cannot talk about the phenomenon without inviting it in. The briefing wasn't just a transfer of information, it was a transmission of a virus. According to the reports from the team, the Department of Homeland Security officials didn't just have sleepless nights. They experienced a disturbance in the force. The phenomenon followed the briefing. It rippled out from that secure room. We know that in the days following high-level briefings, strange things happen. Orbs appear. Poltergeist activity erupts. The infection spreads. Whether it was the sheer shock of the information or a genuine paranormal backlash, the enthusiasm at the Department of Homeland Security began to waver. Fear set in. Not the fear of aliens, but the fear of the stigma. And then came the immune response. The proposal for Kona Blue moved up the chain of command at the Department of Homeland Security. It landed on the desk of the Deputy Secretary, Jane Hall Lute. She was supportive. She saw the value. But then it hit a wall. It hit the desk of Phyllis Green, the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. Green was a hardliner. She was a creature of the intelligence community. She looked at the proposal. She looked at the talk of skinwalkers, consciousness, and UFOs, and she killed it. She didn't just say no. She strangled it. She argued that this program would bring shame to the department. She argued that it was outside their job description. She argued that it was lacking merit. That phrase, lacking merit, is the tombstone of Kona Blue. It wasn't a scientific judgment, it was a political one. It was a way of saying, we are not touching this radioactive material. The rejection was absolute. The lifeboat had been torpedoed. Lacatski was out of options. The Defense Intelligence Agency had pushed him out. The Department of Homeland Security had shut the door. The funding from the Senate had dried up. AAWSAP was dead. The 50 people in Las Vegas were laid off. The secure facility was closed. The lights were turned off. But what happened to the data? What happened to the 38 heavy technical reports? What happened to the massive database? What happened to the medical records of the victims? They didn't vanish. You can kill a program, but you cannot kill a secret. The files were packed up. The hard drives were locked down. The physical evidence, the strange metals, the soil samples was secured. Lacatski ensured that the data was preserved. He transferred the reports to the Defense Intelligence Agency archives. He hid them in the system. He buried them deep, behind a high security wall, where he hoped they would be safe. But he also knew that the government couldn't be trusted to keep the flame alive. The bureaucracy had proven that it would rather be blind than face the impossible. So, the secret went underground. This is where the story gets truly dark. This is where we enter the shell game. AAWSAP was a government program. It was subject to public information requests. It was subject to Congress asking questions. It was vulnerable. But private industry is different. A corporation has rights that the government does not. A corporation can keep a secret forever. Lacatski and his allies realized that if they wanted to protect the crown jewels, the physical craft, the hard evidence, they had to get it out of the hands of the bureaucrats. They had to move it into the private sector. This is the birth of the immortal compartment. We are not talking about a conspiracy theory. We are talking about independent research and development. This is a legal loophole. It allows aerospace companies to spend their own money on research. And because it is their money, the results are their property. They are trade secrets. Congress cannot ask for them. The president cannot demand them. They are blacker than black. The legacy of AAWSAP isn't just the reports in the Defense Intelligence Agency basement. It is the knowledge that the investigation didn't stop. It just went private. Lacatski wasn't done. He was angry. He had seen the truth. He had seen the threat. And he had watched his own government choose ignorance over security. He decided to fight the counterintelligence war on his own terms. He didn't leak. He didn't break his oath. He did something smarter. He used the system against itself. He wrote a book. He wrote Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. He wrote inside the U.S. government covert UFO program. He submitted these books to the Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review. This is the censorship board of the Pentagon. He forced them to review every word. He forced them to admit, by approving the text, that the program existed. And he included one sentence that changed history. One sentence that acted as a tripwire for the entire cover-up. The United States is in possession of a craft of unknown origin and has successfully gained access to its interior. He dared them to cross it out. He dared them to say it was classified. If they crossed it out, they were admitting it was true, and that it was a state secret. If they let it through, they were admitting it was true, and that Lacatski was allowed to say it. They let it through. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was incompetence. Or possibly there are people inside the system who want the truth to come out. But the counterintelligence war didn't end with the book. It just changed shape. Today we have a new office called AARO. They are the public face of the government's UFO hunt. They issue reports. They testify to Congress. They say they have found no credible evidence of extraterrestrial technology. Dr. Lacatski looks at Arrow, and he sees the same enemy he fought in 2009. He calls it a major and repetitive counterintelligence operation. He believes they are doing their job, and their job is not to tell the truth. Their job is containment. Their job is to put the genie back in the bottle. They dismiss the AAWSAP data. They call it paranormal. They ignore the biological effects. They ignore the skinwalkers. They try to drag the conversation back to nuts and bolts, back to drones and balloons. They are trying to rebuild the wall that Lacatski tore down. But it's too late. The signal is out. The public knows about the Tic Tac. They know about the strange metals. They know about the health effects. The AAWSAP program failed to survive the bureaucracy, but it succeeded in something far more important. It infected the world with the truth, and now we have to deal with the consequences. We have to deal with the fact that our government has evidence of a superior intelligence, and they have hidden it in a corporate vault. We have to deal with the fact that this intelligence can hurt us, and we have no defense. We watched the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications program die. We saw the funding dry up, the lights go out in Las Vegas, and the scientists pack their boxes. By 2011, on paper, the US government's hunt for UFOs was officially over. The system had won. The immune system had purged the infection. But here is the problem with killing a program. You still have to deal with the body. AAWSAP wasn't just a think tank or a group of guys sitting around talking about Star Trek. It was an active intelligence operation that gathered terabytes of data and collected soil samples from ground traces. It analyzed the medical records of injured citizens. And if we believe the absolute truth stated by Dr. James Lacatski, this program had access to something far more dangerous than paper. It had access to discovered materials. When a program like this ends, there is a standard procedure. You archive the files, shred the sensitive documents, and wipe the hard drives. But you cannot shred a warp drive. You cannot wipe the hard drive of a craft that modifies space-time. So where did it go? Did they put it in a crate in a massive government warehouse like the end of a movie? Did they bury it in a silo in Nevada? No. That would be too risky because a government warehouse is subject to inspection and the Freedom of Information Act. If a persistent journalist or a stubborn senator asks the right question, the government is legally obligated to answer. Dr. Lacatski and the architects of this secrecy knew that the U.S. Constitution is a double-edged sword. It gives the government power, but it also gives the people oversight. So they made a choice that fundamentally changed the nature of the secret. They decided that the crown jewels of the phenomenon, the physical evidence, the craft, the biology, were too dangerous to be owned by the public. They decided to move them. They took the most important discovery in human history and played a shell game. Tonight, we are going to track the movement of that shell and see how the government laundered the truth. We are going to expose the legal loopholes, the corporate shields, and the immortal compartments that keep the reality locked away from the very people who paid for it. We are going to find out why the President of the United States doesn't know what is in the hangar, and we are going to find out who actually does. To understand the shell game, you have to understand the difference between a state secret and a trade secret. A state secret belongs to the nation and is classified to protect national security. Ultimately, it is owned by the government, the president can declassify it, and Congress can subpoena it. It exists within the chain of command. A trade secret, however, belongs to a corporation. It is private property and intellectual capital protected by commercial law. The government cannot simply walk into Coca-Cola and demand the recipe for their soda, nor can they walk into Google and demand the source code for their search engine. These are proprietary assets. The architects of the cover-up realized that this legal distinction was the ultimate shield. If the U.S. Air Force possesses a flying saucer, it is a political problem. But if Lockheed Martin possesses a flying saucer, it is a corporate asset. Lacatski knew this game and saw how the system worked. When AAWSAP was dissolving and the transfer to DHS failed, there was a scramble to secure the assets. The files were buried in secure networks, accessible only to those with the highest need to know. But the physical materials, the artifacts, went somewhere else. Lacatski has hinted, with extreme caution, at where they went. He has spoken of independent research and development, or IRAD. This is the magic trick. IRAD is a rule in federal contracting that allows private aerospace companies to spend their own money on research. If they spend their own funds, even if the original idea came from a government contract, they keep the rights to the invention. So here is the play. The government retrieves a craft and hands custody of it to a private contractor for analysis. The contractor spends its own money, independent research and development funds, to study the object. The contractor then declares that any discoveries or technologies derived from that study are proprietary trade secrets. Suddenly, the craft is no longer a government secret. It is a corporate secret off the books. It is immune to FOIA and congressional inquiry. If a senator asks the Pentagon, "Do you have a UFO?" the Pentagon can honestly say, "No, Senator, we do not." Because they don't, the contractor does. And if the senator asks the contractor, they say, "That is proprietary information. We are protecting our shareholders." This is the vault. It isn't a physical bunker. It is a legal fortress built of contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and corporate law, and it is impenetrable. But Dr. Lacatski didn't just leave us with a theory, he left us a map. He couldn't tell us exactly where the bodies were buried, because that would violate his oath and send him to prison. But he could leave breadcrumbs, and the biggest breadcrumb of all is hidden in the proposal for Project Kona Blue. Remember, Kona Blue was the failed attempt to move the program to the Department of Homeland Security. The documents regarding this proposal were eventually declassified but heavily redacted, with black lines covering the most sensitive parts. But Lacatski told us to look closer, claiming the censors missed a single unredacted line that changes everything. It is a throwaway line, a piece of bureaucratic housekeeping listing the deliverables of the proposed program. The line reads, "Associated existing and discovered information and materials." Stop and read that again. Discovered materials. You do not write a budget proposal to analyze discovered materials unless you have already discovered them. You don't ask for funding to study a unicorn unless you have a unicorn in the stable. If the program was purely theoretical, the language would say potential materials or suspected recovery. But it says discovered. Past tense, definite. Lacatski is telling us that the physical evidence exists. It isn't a hypothesis, it is inventory. He went further in his book, making a statement that is legally equivalent to a confession. The United States is in possession of a craft of unknown origin and has successfully gained access to its interior. The Pentagon reviewed this book and stamped it cleared for public release. Why would they allow a former program manager to admit that the U.S. has a UFO? There are only two possibilities. Possibility A, it's a lie, a disinformation campaign. But why would the Pentagon want the world to think they have alien tech? Because that invites chaos. Possibility B, it's true. Because it is a trade secret held by a private company, the government can technically claim it doesn't possess it in the legal sense, allowing Lacatski to say it without revealing a classified government program. This is the nuance of the shell game. The government doesn't have it, a company has it. Let's talk about that statement again. Access to its interior. This implies they haven't just photographed it, they have opened the door and walked inside. What did they find? Lacatski describes a technological void. The craft has an aerodynamic shape, but inside, there is no engine, no fuel tanks, no cockpit controls, no wires, and no life support. It is empty. Imagine buying a Ferrari that looks sleek and fast. But when you open the hood, there is no engine. You open the door, and there is no steering wheel or pedals, just a seat. Yet the car goes 200 miles per hour. But how? The craft isn't a machine in the way we understand machines. The hull is the machine. The interior is empty because the function is distributed throughout the material of the craft. The walls are the engine, the floor is the computer, and the skin is the sensor array. And the control. The AAWSAP report suggests the interface is psychic. The pilot doesn't use their hands, they use their mind via a bioneural interface. You think go, and the craft goes. This explains why our best pilots can't fly them. We have recovered these things, but we can't turn them on because we don't have the mental key or the right frequency of consciousness. It's like giving an iPhone to a chimpanzee. The hardware is there, but the chimp doesn't know the passcode. This is the frustration of the reverse engineering program. We have the shell, but we don't have the ghost. So, why keep it secret? If we can't fly it or replicate it, why hide it? Why not give it to the world scientists? because of the resource monopoly. The corporate gatekeepers aren't hiding it because they are afraid of aliens. They are hiding it because they are afraid of free energy. The craft runs on zero-point energy, harvesting the vacuum. It doesn't need gas, coal, wind, or solar. It has an infinite, portable power source. If you crack that technology, you get a device the size of a microwave that can power a city. The oil industry, the coal industry, the utility grid, and the petrodollar would collapse overnight. The global economy is built on the scarcity of energy. If energy becomes free, the economy as we know it ends. The power structures of the world, geopolitical alliances, banking systems, and the military-industrial complex would dissolve. The gatekeepers are protecting the status quo in their portfolios. They are hoarding the technology because they want to figure out how to meter the infinite and sell us energy that the universe gives away for free. But Lacatski warned us of a darker reason. The immortal compartment isn't just hiding a battery, it is hiding a weapon. If you can manipulate space-time to fly, you can manipulate it to destroy. A warp drive is a bomb, and a zero-point energy device is a nuke that leaves no radiation. The gatekeepers believe humanity is not ready. They look at our wars and violence and see toddlers with loaded guns. They believe that if they release this technology, we won't build a utopia. We will build a planet killer. So they keep it in the vault and justify the secrecy as national security, though Lacatski calls it a counterintelligence operation against the American people. By hiding the truth, they leave us defenseless and blind to reality. The shell game has worked for 80 years, surviving presidencies, wars, and the internet, but it is starting to crack. The language in the Kona Blue proposal, the admission of the breached hull, and the testimony of pilots are chipping away at the wall. Lacatski insists that you can't kill Kona Blue, meaning you cannot kill the idea or the data. Even if the files are buried, the reality of the craft remains. Now we must face the final question. We know the government had a program, found a threat, found a craft, and hid it in the private sector. But what does it all mean? We have reached the end of the line. We have walked the long, dark path from a kitchen in Utah, all the way to the boardrooms of the Pentagon. We cracked open the files on warp drives, biological attacks, and nuclear intrusions. We watched the impossible turn into engineering, and we watched the terrifying become a daily routine. But before we close the book on Dr. James Lacatski and the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, we have to deal with the mess left behind. When you set off a bomb, the explosion is only the start. The second part is the fallout. The fallout of AAWSAP is still settling today. It is a thick cloud of confusion and mixed story that has covered the world since December 2017. If you ask a regular person on the street what the Pentagon's UFO program was called, they won't say AAWSAP. They will say ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. This is the final victory of the spy war. The name of the real program and the $22 million project that hunted werewolves and built warp drive theories has been wiped from history. It has been replaced by a cover story. Let's take apart the Great Confusion. In December 2017, the New York Times ran a front-page story that changed the world. It revealed that the Pentagon ran a secret UFO program. It mentioned the $22 million budget. It mentioned Senator Harry Reid. It mentioned Robert Bigelow. But it got the name wrong. It called the program ATIP. This wasn't just a typo. It was a difference that shaped the story for the next 5 years. AAWSAP was the contract. It was the money. It was the wide search for ghosts, biological effects, and futuristic technology. It was the program that looked at the whole elephant. ATIP was just a nickname. It was a public label used in a single letter to get the program's special security status. Later, after the real funding dried up, ATIP became a small, unfunded effort run by Elizondo just to keep the lights on. But why does this matter? Why worry about acronyms? Because ATIP was safe. ATIP focused on military encounters. It focused on pilots and radar screens. It fit the nuts and bolts story the Pentagon wanted to tell. It was clean. It was easy to defend. AAWSAP was dangerous. They studied the skinwalkers, the hitchhikers that followed people home, and it studied how this connects to the human mind. It was messy and it was weird. By letting the media confuse the two, the Pentagon won a strategic victory. They let the public know about the Tic Tac UFO, the safe military encounter, while keeping the shadow of Skinwalker Ranch buried. They cleaned up the program's reputation by stripping away the weird, high strangeness elements. Dr. Lacatski watched this happen. He saw the story being hijacked. He saw his life's work being rewritten as a simple study of drones and balloons. That is why he stepped out of the shadows. That is why he wrote the books. He wanted to fix the record. He wanted to say, no, we didn't just look at the machines. We looked at the ghosts. And the ghosts are real. This brings us to Dr. Lacatski's smartest move. The Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review acts as the gatekeeper of Pentagon secrets. If you have a security clearance and want to write a book, you must send it to them first. They go through it with the black marker and cross out anything that hurts national security. Lacatski sent them his manuscript. He sent them the details of the 38 technical reports. He sent them the accounts of the Hitchhiker Effect. And he sent them that one radioactive sentence. The United States is in possession of a craft of unknown origin and has successfully gained access to its interior. By all the rules of the secret world, that sentence should have been blacked out. It confirms we have alien technology. It confirms the Holy Grail. But they cleared it. They stamped it. Approved. But why? There are a few theories. Theory 1. The mistake. The censors were overwhelmed. They missed it. They didn't realize what it meant. This seems unlikely for the most paranoid organization on Earth. Theory 2. The legal loophole. As we discussed with the shell game, the craft is held by a private contractor. It is a trade secret, not a state secret. Therefore, technically, the government doesn't possess it. A corporation does. Lacatski's statement was true, but legally distinct enough to pass because it didn't technically reveal a current government classified program. Theory 3. Soft disclosure. There is a group within the Pentagon who want this out. They used Lacatski to leak it. They allowed him to say it because they know the secret can't be kept forever. They are slowly turning the pressure valve to prevent an explosion. Whatever the reason, the words are in print. They are part of the official record. A program manager with a top secret clearance stated, with Pentagon approval, wrote that we have the craft. This is the legacy. It is a trail of breadcrumbs that leads directly to the hangar door, but that legacy is under attack. Today, the official story is controlled by AARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. They are the public face of the investigation, and their message is consistent. We have found no credible evidence of extraterrestrial activity, off-world technology, or objects that defy the known laws of physics. Dr. Lacatski calls this a counterintelligence operation. Think about the mental conflict here. On one side, you have the architect of the $22 million program saying, "We have the craft, and we have opened it." On the other side, you have the current office saying, "We haven't found anything." They cannot both be true. One of them is lying. One of them is gaslighting the American public. Lacatski argues that AARO is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is a filter. It looks at the data, strips out the weird stuff, ignores the biological effects, dismisses the physics it can't explain, and reports on the leftovers. It is a machine built to say, "Nothing to see here." They dismiss the Skinwalker data as paranormal. They dismiss the consciousness connection as unscientific. They are trying to force the phenomenon back into a box that it broke out of 50 years ago. But Lacatski's legacy is the proof that the box is broken. You cannot unsee the yellow tube. You cannot uninfect the Axelrod family. And you cannot unfind the Russian documents. The truth is like a virus. And thanks to AAWSAP, the virus is loose. So where does this leave us? We are standing at the horizon. We are looking out at a landscape that has changed forever. We used to think we were alone. We used to think we were the masters of the planet. We used to think that if there were aliens, they were far away, visiting us in metal ships, obeying the speed of light. AAWSAP destroyed that worldview. The program proved that the interlopers are not visitors. They are residents. They are here. They have always been here. They are in the ocean. They are in the atmosphere. They are in the soil of Utah. They proved that the phenomenon is not just technological, it is interdimensional. It manipulates space and time. It manipulates the human mind. It walks through walls. They proved that the phenomenon is not friendly. It is a threat. It turns off our nukes. It injures our citizens. It spreads contagion. It manages us like a farmer manages a herd. And they proved that our government knows. They proved that the silence is not due to ignorance. It is due to fear. The veil is not a natural barrier. It is a wall built by the phenomenon to keep us calm and reinforced by the government to keep us obedient. But the AAWSAP program poked a hole in the veil, and now we are staring right through it. This brings us to the final question. The question Dr. Lacatski left for us in his books. The question that hangs over every page of those 38 reports. Who are they? Are they aliens from deep space? Are they time travelers from our own future? Are they beings from the dimension right next door? Or are they something ancient, something that has shared this planet with us since the beginning, hiding in the shadows of our vision? The data suggests they are a control system. They intervene when we get too dangerous, like with nuclear missiles. They intervene when we get too arrogant, like with fighter jets. They intervene when we get too close, like at Skinwalker Ranch. They are the gardeners, and we are the garden. The legacy of AAWSAP is the realization that the garden is not safe. Dr. Lacatski did his job. He identified the threat, he built the database, he wrote the physics, and then he handed the keys to us. He cannot tell us more. He is bound by oaths and laws. He has gone as far as he can go without handcuffs. Now the burden of truth is on you. You have the map. You know about the shell game. You know about the Kona Blue documents. You know about the legal loopholes. You know that the craft is real. And you know it is sitting in a hangar owned by a corporation, protected by lawyers. The government will not share this voluntarily. Aero will not hold a press conference and wheel out the flying saucer. The system is too strong. The fear of having our reality shattered is too great. The only way the veil comes down is if we pull it down. We have to ask the dangerous questions. We have to demand the uncensored files. We have to look at the paranormal not as magic, but as physics we don't understand yet. We have to be brave enough to look at the hitchhiker. We have to be brave enough to look into the abyss, because the abyss has already been looking into us. The door is unlocked, and the secret is yours to claim. We stand at the crossroads and we have to decide. Do we want to know what is on the other side of the veil? Are we ready to open the door? Because once you cross that threshold, there is no going back. As we step back from the crossroads, remember the story doesn't end here, because this is just the beginning, searching for the knowledge and wisdom to unravel the mysteries of our universe. Unexplained sightings, spirits, and science. They are all connected in the grand tapestry of life. So remember, keep pulling at the threads, because this has been Crossroads of the Veil.